What happens when the man crowned to rule France chooses to live not as its king, but as its most elaborate queen? The great hall of the Louvre shimmered under the glow of 1,000 candles. Golden light danced across polished silver, crystal goblets, and the rose-colored silk that draped the figure at the center of it all. Lace framed his powdered face, a rope of pearls rested on his chest, and the air was heavy with the scent of imported perfume. Courtiers bowed, yet their eyes lingered too long, their smiles tight. This was not the image of a warrior monarch, not the figure Europe expected to see when it imagined the ruler of France. It was Henry III, and he had made himself the centerpiece of a court that felt more like a stage than a seat of power. Whispers moved through the room as easily as the music. Some saw elegance, others saw defiance, but few could forget what they were witnessing, a king who chose to live as if the boundaries of gender, tradition, and faith could be brushed aside like dust from a silk sleeve. In an age when the church shaped morality and the crown embodied strength, Henry stood as a living contradiction. The question was not whether his choices would offend, but how long it would be before those choices became a weapon in the hands of his enemies. History would not grant him the quiet death of a sovereign surrounded by family and the soft prayers of priests. His end would come far from the grandeur of the banquet hall, in the silence of his own chamber. No trumpets, no mourning procession, only the flash of a dagger and the warm spill of blood onto cold stone. A man who had ruled with silk and ceremony would be struck down in a moment of brutal finality. So how does a reign built on image and refinement descend into violence? And how does a kingdom decide that the most dangerous thing about its ruler is the way he chooses to live? Henry III was born Alexandre Edouard on September 19, 1551, within the ornate chambers of the Château de Fontainebleau. The corridors were lined with heavy tapestries that softened each step, and the air carried the scent of beeswax and polished oak. He was the fourth son of King Henry II and Catherine de' Medici, a child of the Valois dynasty whose birth was marked by ceremony and expectation. From the moment he arrived, he was swaddled not only in fine linens but in the weight of royal tradition. The court into which he was born was a place where politics and performance were inseparable. Tutors, carefully chosen for both intellect and discretion, instructed him in Latin, Greek, and the principles of rhetoric. While other princes trained in the courtyards with swords and pikes, Alexandre Edouard was often found in chambers where the sound of the lute filled the air, where dancers rehearsed steps in patterned sequences, and where bolts of silk from Florence were unfurled for inspection. It was in these settings that his preferences began to emerge. He would run his fingers along brocade and velvet, studying the drape of fabric and the precision of its embroidery. The glitter of gemstones and the subtle sheen of satin seemed to hold his attention in a way no weapon ever could. To many, these were harmless inclinations, the natural curiosities of youth. In time, they would become a signature of his identity. Beyond the palace walls, France was in turmoil. The wars of religion between Catholics and Huguenots sent shockwaves through every province. Fires gutted towns, and rivers carried the debris of siege and slaughter. From the safety of the royal residences, he heard reports of these conflicts with a mixture of fascination and caution. As a younger son, he was not the immediate heir. Yet his position required him to witness councils where fragile truces were negotiated with one hand and undermined with the other. This upbringing forced him to navigate two distinct worlds. One was the realm of steel, where loyalty was proven on the battlefield. The other was the realm of the silk crown, where influence was built on charm, spectacle, and the careful shaping of perception. While he could adapt to both, the second spoke more clearly to his instincts. He found comfort in the soft rustle of a well-tailored robe, in the warm glow of candlelight over polished silver, and in the subtle art of holding attention without raising his voice. By the time he reached adolescence, his reputation within the court was already formed. He was known as a prince who could bow with perfect grace before a visiting ambassador, then retreat to his chambers to redesign the arrangement of his attire for the next feast. His diplomatic instincts were undeniable, and he had a gift for reading the shifting tensions in a room. With a single gesture or a measured pause, he could turn suspicion into curiosity or soften an adversary's resolve. These early years shaped a man who would one day wear the crown while ruling as if the court itself was his true kingdom. The lessons learned in candlelit halls filled with music and ceremony would follow him to the throne, where they would serve as both his greatest strength and his most dangerous vulnerability. Henry's return from Poland in 1574 marked the start of a reign unlike any France had known. Crowned at Reims as the kingdom's sovereign, he stepped into a fractured realm still reeling from religious conflict. Instead of adopting the austere image of a war-hardened ruler, he set about transforming the court into a reflection of his own tastes and vision. At the Louvre, royal authority took on a new face. Henry appeared in flowing gowns of rare silks, their colors shifting with the light. His powdered complexion and faintly rouged lips framed a presence scented with perfumes imported from Italy. Every detail was deliberate, crafted to make his image as commanding as his crown. Surrounding him were the mignons, young courtiers whose jewel-toned attire, lace collars, and intricate embroidery mirrored the king's own style. They followed him in public and private, their devotion making them as much a part of his persona as any emblem of state. To his admirers, they represented a cultivated elegance. To his detractors, they were symbols of excess. Henry turned the rituals of monarchy into a kind of theater. Audiences, banquets, and festivals were staged with precision music matched to the moment, servants moving with rehearsed grace, and lighting arranged so that the king was always the visual center. Foreign envoys reported not only on politics but on the spectacle they had witnessed, describing a ruler who controlled the court's atmosphere through calculated image rather than force. These displays impressed many but unsettled others. The nobility, raised to respect martial leadership, questioned whether such refinement concealed weakness. The Catholic League, already wary, saw his court as a break from tradition and a challenge to their values. Henry did not seek to placate them. Instead, he deepened his commitment to the world he was building inside the palace, one in which beauty and ceremony were the tools of governance. For a time, his vision held. The court dazzled. Foreign ambassadors spoke of its sophistication, and Henry stood unchallenged at its center. Yet beyond the palace gates, the same unrest that had scarred France for decades persisted. While candlelight spilled across marble floors in the Louvre, the discontent outside was beginning to coalesce into something far more dangerous. Within the walls of the Louvre, Henry's court became a realm of constant spectacle. Nights were filled with banquets where the tables bent under the weight of gilded platters, imported delicacies, and wines chosen from the finest vineyards in France and Italy. Candles glowed in silver candelabra, throwing warm light onto walls draped with tapestries and onto the silks and satins worn by the king and his closest companions. These gatherings were not merely moments of leisure. They were orchestrated displays in which every seat, every toast, and every note of music reinforced the image Henry had chosen for himself. Masquerade balls were among his most elaborate productions. The courtyards were transformed into enchanted spaces lit by hundreds of torches, where courtiers in jeweled masks moved through the night like characters from a living painting. Henry often appeared in costumes so intricate that they blurred the line between monarch and queen, his robes embroidered with gold thread, his hair arranged to perfection, and his perfume trailing in the air long after he passed. Such evenings could last until dawn, with music, dancing, and carefully staged tableaux designed to dazzle and disarm. The expense of maintaining this vision was immense. Treasures from across Europe were brought to Paris to furnish his halls and dress his court. Seamstresses and jewelers worked without pause to create garments that would outshine the last. For Henry, this was more than indulgence. It was a political tool, a way to project refinement and control in a kingdom scarred by division. Yet for many nobles, it became a symbol of detachment from the realities beyond the palace gates. Whispers began to circulate more freely. In smoky salons and guarded corridors, there was talk of the king's relationships with his mignons. Rumors painted him as a man devoted not to the queen's bed, but to the company of young men whose beauty and devotion rivaled that of any royal consort. In an age when such accusations could be used as weapons, they became part of the growing arsenal against him. The disapproval was not confined to the nobility. The Catholic Church, already wary of his reluctance to conform to traditional models of kingship, began to see him as a threat to the moral order. From pulpits, sermons spoke of decadence and warned of rulers who led their people astray through vanity and vice. The Catholic League, under the leadership of Henri de Guise, seized upon this image, presenting themselves as defenders of faith and tradition against a monarch they claimed had abandoned both. Henry, aware of the hostility gathering beyond the palace walls, did not retreat. He continued to host lavish festivals, commissioning spectacles that drew artists, musicians, and architects into his orbit. In his mind, the court was the heart of the kingdom, and as long as it beat with beauty and ceremony, France could not collapse. But the growing disdain outside the palace was no longer just a matter of whispered criticism. It was becoming a political force, one that would soon challenge not only his image but his very survival. Henry had learned that in a court filled with rivals, the most dangerous weapon could be the one no one recognized as a threat. He cultivated a public image that made adversaries believe he was harmless in matters of state. Behind the softness they thought they saw, he was shaping alliances, disarming hostility, and placing pieces on the political board with deliberate care. In private councils, he often let his opponents speak at length, nodding as if in agreement. The pauses he allowed seemed to invite confidence, and soon they would reveal more than they intended. By the time decisions were reached, Henry had already arranged the outcome. He could tilt the balance of a discussion without a single raised voice, his control masked beneath the courtesy of listening. On certain occasions, he staged rituals whose true purpose was invisible to most. A reception for foreign envoys might appear to be no more than a ceremonial welcome, but the order of who approached the throne and when could shift the perception of rank within moments. A rival expecting to be called first could be made to wait. His influence quietly diminished before negotiations even began. allies could be elevated with subtle gestures, reinforcing their loyalty without open declarations. His mastery of these tactics extended to handling disputes among the nobility. When tensions rose between factions, he would call for gatherings that seemed purely festive. Yet the seating, the flow of conversation, and the timing of private invitations were all arranged to isolate certain voices while strengthening others. Those who underestimated the intent of these occasions often left finding themselves politically weakened. Yet the same image that allowed him to win in the shadows eroded his standing with those who measured leadership by more visible standards. Commanders in the army, schooled in the traditions of kings who rode with their soldiers and shared the hardships of campaign, found little to admire in a ruler who seemed to fight his battles through ceremony. They respected strategy, but not the kind that played out in reception halls and council chambers. Among the conservative nobility, doubts hardened into quiet opposition. For them, the king's authority was meant to be plain, decisive, and unmistakable. The idea that influence could be maintained through indirect means felt dangerously fragile. Some began to believe that his reliance on courtly maneuvering was a sign that he could no longer govern the kingdom beyond the palace walls. Henry was aware of their unease but refused to abandon the methods that had kept him in control of a court rife with factions. To him, the elegance and composure that others saw as weakness were the very qualities that allowed him to survive. Still, the distance between what he valued and what his realm expected was widening. And with it came the risk that the subtle power he held inside the palace would be of little use against the forces gathering outside it. By the late 1580s, the tide within France had shifted decisively. Henri de Guise, already a towering figure among the Catholic League, had become the symbol of resistance to a monarchy that many believed had strayed from its sacred duty. His reputation as a man of faith and a leader of action drew not only the devout, but also nobles who had once pledged loyalty to the crown. Each new alliance he forged pulled another thread from the fabric of Henry III's authority. The League's influence spread through Paris like a slow but unstoppable current. Public squares echoed with sermons warning of a kingdom in moral peril. Pamphlets circulated, painting the king as unfit to rule and elevating de Guise as the defender of the faith. In council chambers, men who had once bowed readily to Henry now hesitated, weighing the risks of standing against the League. The court that had once revolved around the king was breaking into smaller orbits, each drawn toward its own center of gravity. The confrontation could not be avoided. In December 1588, Henry struck back with a sudden act of violence, ordering the assassination of de Guise during a royal meeting in Blois. The blow was meant to shatter the League's leadership, but instead it ignited a fire that spread beyond his control. Outrage swept through Paris, and the city, already restless, turned openly hostile. The king's presence was no longer a guarantee of safety. By mid-1589, Henry found himself increasingly isolated. The streets of Paris were unsafe, and the loyalty of his own capital could no longer be assumed. With the League in open defiance and the populace stirred to rebellion, he was forced to withdraw from the city. His retreat marked more than a strategic decision. It was a visible sign that the crown had lost its hold on the heart of France. That summer, the weight of events closed in on him. While encamped outside Paris, he sought to rally what forces remained, aligning himself with former enemies in the hope of reclaiming the city. Yet within the royal camp itself, dangers lingered unseen. On the morning of August 1st, 1589, a young Dominican friar named Jacques Clément gained entry, claiming to bring urgent letters. The guards, unsuspecting, allowed him through. Inside the king's chamber, Clement presented his papers with apparent humility. As Henry leaned forward to receive them, the friar drew a dagger concealed beneath his cloak. The blade struck deep before the attendants could react. In the chaos that followed, Clement was cut down, but the damage was done. Henry collapsed, blood seeping into the floor, his voice struggling to form words. He lingered through the day, aware of the mortal wound, speaking final instructions to those still near him. By nightfall, the reign that had been shaped as much by image as by policy was over. The man who had once commanded the stage of the Louvre had been brought down in the most private of settings, not by an army in the field, but by a single hand in a closed room. The crown of France would pass on, but the shadow of his fall would remain. The chamber where Henry III had taken his last breath fell into stillness. Servants moved quietly, their steps softened by thick carpets, careful not to disturb the heavy air. In one corner, a robe of pale silk hung loosely over the back of a chair, the folds catching the last flickers of candlelight. The perfume that had so often followed him through the halls was faint now, mingling with the scent of extinguished wicks. One by one, the flames guttered out, leaving only the dull glow of embers in the hearth. Outside, word of the king's death spread quickly. For some, it was the end of an era marked by indulgence and distraction. For others, it was the fall of a ruler who had dared to stand apart from the traditions that bound his predecessors. In Paris, the Catholic League celebrated the removal of a monarch they had long declared unworthy. Across Europe, ambassadors sent back reports tinged with judgment, reducing a complex reign to whispers of scandal, vanity, and misplaced priorities. Historians of the time recorded him less as a strategist and more as a cautionary tale. His elegance became caricature, his court reduced to stories of excess. The subtleties of his political maneuvering, the moments when he had held factions in balance with calculated grace, were forgotten or dismissed. The written record hardened into a narrative that suited his enemies, a king who cared more for silk than for steel, who lost his crown to the weight of his own affectations. Yet in the margins of history, a different view endured. Those who had served close to him remembered a man who had refused to let the crown dictate every aspect of his identity. In an age when kings were bound by rigid codes of conduct, he had lived as if those codes could be rewritten. His court was a reflection of his belief that authority could be expressed through refinement as much as through force, and that control of perception could be as decisive as control of armies. His death did not erase the mark he left. The image of a French king who openly defied the expectations of his station lingered, unsettling for some, inspiring for others. It posed questions that remained long after the man himself was gone. How far can a ruler bend the shape of kingship before it breaks, and what is lost when history chooses to remember only the parts that fit its preferred story? In the silence of that final room, with the silk robe resting untouched and the last candle dying, the story of Henry III became one more reminder that the crown can be both a gift and a curse. If a throne can turn a life into a sentence, how many more secrets lie buried beneath its weight, waiting to be unearthed in the torture throne?